Hey folks, Dr. Franklin here, and in this presentation we're going to talk about the building blocks as it pertains to intimate relationships. Why even discuss intimate relationships? I know some people may have that question. How does intimate relationships differ from casual encounters? What characterizes intimate relationships and what are key building blocks of relationships? All of these questions and more will be covered in this presentation. My hope is that you walk away with insights based on relationship research that you can reflect upon and perhaps use in your own relationships in addition to whatever academic goals you may have involving this content. Intimate relationships differ from casual encounters in that these relationships are characterized by knowledge, interdependence, caring, trust, responsiveness, mutuality, and commitment. For example, a cashier that you just met doesn't have intimate knowledge about your upbringing. In regard to interdependence, you may not rely on that acquaintance at work for your income or for some child related duties. You may not have any real desire to display long term affection for the date you had last week, and thus the care component could be absent in a casual encounter. Trust may not be an issue with some of your casual encounters, in that one time business transactions may just be that. And there's no expectation for them to treat you fairly and honestly because they will not be around long. The expectation that the person you met at the conference will be responsive by meeting your needs after the conference may be non existent. In terms of mutuality, many that have one night stands do not perceive the charismatic, sexy, intelligent person as an ideal partner, and thus there's no conversion of them from I and you to we. Finally, casual encounters may be very seasonal in that there is no expectation for others to be around long enough for commitment that stands the test of time in some ortholite cloud shoes. You see, intimate relationships can have some of these components, and some intimate relationships can have all of them. I'm sure you may have even met the miserable, surly couple that's high in commitment and interdependence and everything else is non existent. They're an example of the latter two relationships I just mentioned. Then there could be the couple high in knowledge, caring, and responsiveness, but commitment is lacking. An intimate relationship does not need all of these components, but it typically has some. Now, why do we have intimate relationships? I'm so glad you thought that. Well, the simple answer is that we're social species. There's an aspect of our being that craves interactions with others. There's a reason why prisons have solitary confinement as punishment. There's a reason why individuals struggled in 2020 to quarantine because of the coronavirus 2019 pandemic. It's because most folks can't go too long without interacting with another human being in a meaningful way. Intimate relationships can bring us great joy when things are going well, and they can bring us great sorrow if they're going badly. So, given how central they are to our lives, it's worth exploring how they start, how they operate, how they flourish, and sometimes end in anger and a blaze of pain. Now, ultimately, we're discussing intimate relationships between men and women, and thus it's worth exploring differences across the species as it relates to desires, preferences, and interest in relationships. You've often heard the saying that men are from Mars and women are from Venus. This was something touted as truth since the early 1990s, and perhaps this has fed into the stereotype of men and women being completely different species. This idea that men and women are like separate species because they differ in terms of their preferences, interests, and abilities is simply false. I wish I could say nothing could be further from the truth, but unfortunately, there are notions out there that are further from the truth than this one. Like you can't change the world with your given talent and abilities, for example. Research shows that men and women actually overlap each other a great deal, and both sexes look for affection, warmth, loyalty, and emotional connectivity in intimate relationships. Sure, men have been shown to have a higher sex drive than women, and there are some significant differences. But the caveat to that, folks, is that a significant difference does not necessarily equate to a practical significance. And there's usually greater differences within the sexes than across the sexes. For example, men usually have sex before women, and men usually masturbate more than women, but these are not drastic differences, but rather small to moderate differences, with both sexes on average hovering near the other sex's average. Some of you may have caught that. The other sex. I'm using the other sex instead of the opposite sex because the opposite sex wording continues to perpetuate this notion that men and women are very different from each other when in actuality they are not. Men don't just want a naked body and women don't just want to cuddle and watch Love Actually. These are stereotypes that cause hopelessness and pessimism, stereotypes that should get no play in your house like a Jensen radio from Target. Now, what are some of the things that influence the types of relationships we have? Well, I'm so glad you didn't ask that, so I can try to act like I'm overly educated here and I'm just too good for my own good with this smug look on my face. Let's talk about culture in the form of time period, attachment styles, gender differences, personality, and sexual orientation as it influences our relationships. I'll tell you what's different in this day and time, and that's the rate in which men and women are getting married. You know, back in the 1960s, most women were married before 21 and most men were married before 23. In 1960, 94% of folks married at some point in their lives. When they got married, it was for the long haul. No U-Haul was going to show up and move somebody out. Nowadays, only about half of the adult population is presently married. A lot has changed since the 1960s that has contributed to these marital changes. Some of these changes include economic opportunities for women, technology, changing sex ratios, materialism, acceptability of cohabitation, etc. Getting at cohabitation or living with your partner before wedlock. Understand that cohabitation is big now, but in the 1960s it was practically non existent. It simply didn't happen. And it's ironic that it's so big now because you know what research shows about cohabitation? Research shows that the longer individuals cohabit, the lower the likelihood they'll get married, and the probability of the relationship dissolving stays relatively the same. Now, take a moment and think about that. One would think that the longer a couple would stay together, that the probability of them breaking up would actually decrease, but the research is actually saying that there's no change in regard to it over time. Hmm. Now, research has also shown that there's a lower likelihood, that the individuals will actually jump the broom. Now, some individuals out there may go, well, that ain't my story, and he or she gonna put a ring on it. Well, I hope for your sake, or for their sake, or for whoever's sake, that's the truth, because everyone deserves to have that special moment with an intimate partner. Research reports on behaviors of groups of individuals, but it's important to note that there are individual differences. However, this doesn't negate the research that strongly supports that the aforementioned cohabitation results apply to most individuals. Attachment styles as a youth influence the type of adult attachment styles one has. You may have heard of Bowlby's research dealing with infants that have different attachment styles to their caregivers, and these attachment styles are based on the caregiver's responsiveness, the child's temperament, and the interaction of both. Well, these attachment styles morph into adult attachment styles that influence how we move forward in intimate relationships. So, in other words, based on childhood experiences, one determines how to pursue intimate relationships, and these different approaches center around either avoidance of intimacy or fear of abandonment. One could be secure, one could be preoccupied with threats to their relationship, one could be fearful of abandonment, or one could be dismissing altogether of intimate relationships. Take a look at the diagram that I placed in the lower right hand corner on the screen. Instinctually, we would like to categorize ourselves as one of the four, but if Christian Grey and psychology has taught you anything, it's that there are shades of gray and we all fall along a continuum. These attachments are learned and thus can be unlearned, but it's going to take a lot of painstaking effort. And what of gender differences? Well, since we determined earlier that men aren't separate species from women, let's talk about gender roles and how they play out in relationships. Sex deals with biological distinctions of men and women, but gender speaks to social and psychological differences between men and women and usually involves traits based on societal expectations. You know what the research says about gender roles in relationships? Dyads, or couples that have individuals that are more androgynous or exude traits that involve traditionally masculine traits like assertion and decisiveness, and also have flexibility of exuding more traditionally feminine traits like warmth, compassion, and kindness, tend to be happier in their relationships in the long run. Those who abide by traditional gender roles tend to be less satisfied in the long run. And oh, by the way, just like opposite sex is being abandoned for other sex, so is masculinity and femininity. Instead, traits that were under the umbrella of masculinity are thought to be instrumental traits, and femininity is thought to be expressive traits. So, have I whet your appetite on relationship research? I sure hope so. I hope you're open to what you can discover in relationship research. After all, openness, extroversion, conscientiousness, and agreeable individuals typically have happier relationships than those who score lower on those traits, and people high in neuroticism tend to have difficult times in relationships given the consistent negative moods and tension in the atmosphere. So I'll end the presentation by saying that it's not worth exploring gay, lesbian, and bisexual relationships separately because they are resoundingly similar to heterosexual couples. The differences between same-sex relationships and other sex relationships I can highlight really quick. Gay men tend to be more expressive, and lesbians tend to be more instrumental, and they're less likely to adhere to traditional gender roles, and they are more likely to be educated and more liberal. When there are differences across heterosexual couples and gay couples, these differences may be based on two people of the same sex being in a relationship and not necessarily because of sexual orientation. For example, research highlights that when gay men enter a new relationship, they have more sex than a heterosexual couple. Why do they have more sex? They're having more sex because you have two men with potentially high sex drives in a relationship. Research shows that gays and lesbians tend to have better relationships than heterosexual couples on average, and they fall in love, feel the same passions, experiences, and doubts that heterosexual couples do. Okay, hopefully I've whet your appetite in regard to relationship research. Hope you enjoyed this presentation, and I look forward to sharing the next relationship goals research presentation with you. Take care.